Hello. So today I'd like to refer to a book that I've just recently read. I've been meaning to read this for a long time, called Embodied, Transgender Identities, the Church, and What the Bible Has to Say. This is written by the Christian writer and speaker and teacher and theologian Preston Sprinkle. I came across his work through a podcast, actually, that a very popular podcast that he has been presenting now, I think, for several years. Certainly, I've been a subscriber for a number of years, called Theology in the Raw, which tackles some very interesting subjects, has many interesting guests, among which quite often he has featured issues around transgender. He is not himself trans, but was very much drawn to an inquiry, almost like being an investigative journalist inquiry, as someone coming from a Christian point of view. This is really what this book is all about, sitting down, trying to understand what Scripture says about how the church should respond to trans people, what the church says, what Scripture says about how God may regard trans people as being a part of his plan. And he tries to do this with a very open mind and open heart and a detailed inquiry. And the invitation to readers is to sit down with him on that inquiry, not necessarily to agree on everything, but to have this open heart. And really, this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but perhaps not very surprising. The conclusion that he draws overall is for the church, for Christians, to be embracing of trans people and not judgmental, to come back to the first principles of loving the other, loving your neighbor as one, essentially. That said, he does believe that we are born into sexed bodies. And that was actually one aspect of this book, which I personally found really quite interesting, is how he came to that conclusion. And I think I come to the same conclusion as well, partly through his argument, actually, that particularly looking at intersex, he has a very, very interesting chapter on intersex and what that means and the different conditions. Very much seeing that not as a third sex, but as there being a few people, and really a minority among intersex people as well, who, in terms of their chromosomes, in terms of their genitalia, in terms of their external appearance, present a mixture, if you like, of both of the binary sexes. And seeing that we are born into sex bodies is very much being part of the plan for humanity. Now, invariably, I am a mystic. I am not tied to what might be called mainstream Christianity and theology. I find it very interesting, very informative very often, particularly on interpretation of ancient Hebrew and the cultural context of certain teaching, for example. And there are some very interesting arguments, philosophical arguments presented by theologians. Preston does this himself actually very well, actually presenting a number of the so-called ontological arguments around the nature of being a man or a woman, and trying to get to this key question around whether biology and or gender is germane to that. But I'm also someone that really appreciates the mystery of transcending what is written, and through meditation, really, and through prayer and so on, actually come to my own understanding. So perhaps, understandably, there's going to be a few areas here that I'm not totally chiming with where he comes from. For example, he does talk about the idea of his belief that we will have resurrected bodies that are sexed. I personally do not hold to that view. I also have I think, a different view to his interpretation of what it means to be in God's image. For me, that is very much about the spiritual qualities, the light what is called in Hebrew Nura, this sort of lantern within the soul's illumination, as it were, is very much more what being in God's image speaks about to me. He says things like, if Jesus didn't have a body, a sex body, he wouldn't have borne God's image. That's not something I personally agree with, although I respect and understand his argument around that. So yes, inevitably there are going to be some things that someone like me is not going to agree with. They don't take away from the overall point of the book, this exploration, this sitting down together and trying as best possible to really understand what the trans debate, the trans issue, issues facing trans people are all about, and where this fits in with Christian faith. And certainly it doesn't take away from coming to the same conclusion. There are also a couple of things, inevitably, I think, in a book like this, whilst it does cover a lot of basis, and he's clearly done his homework on a lot of topics, as I say, on intersex, for example, I found them very informative. And indeed, I would recommend reading that chapter, I think it's chapter 7, out of sequence. I think that will help explain some of his arguments earlier in the book. I would read that pretty early on. But inevitably, there are some things that are missing. So doesn't talk very much about the distinction between gender and body dysphoria, for example. Significantly for me, psychological sex, that important concept introduced by Julia Serrano, isn't tackled at all. And I think it'd be very interesting, perhaps this is something I need to do myself, to go into a theological inquiry on that. There isn't really anything about gender fluidity, where that may fit in. And I think his coverage of the autogynephilia debate is also very thin. It doesn't really get to the point of why so many trans people are offended by that. And I have a sense he tends to kowtow a little bit to the scientists and the theologians. So he says, for example, this is where he's talking about one of the philosophical arguments. This is theological anthropology, in other words, a reflection from a theological point of view on human beings, saying about the theory of strong dualism. That's where the idea that body and soul are distinct parts of being human, and our immaterial soul is more central to who we are than our physical bodies. He says of that isn't a Christian view and borders on the heresy of Gnosticism or has Gnostic tendencies, and goes on to say, almost by way of justifying that view, at least this is how it comes across, even if he's really just perhaps making a statement of fact, nearly everyone in the realm of Christian theology affirms that human persons are physical, embodied beings, and this is an important feature of God's intended design for human life. Now, I agree with that point of view as it happens, but sometimes we do get this. All theologians, or most theologians, say this. There is this implication behind it. Therefore, this is right. If you come from a mystic's point of view, that isn't the case. And indeed, if you're a Gnostic like me, this kind of statement actually is not very respectful. I don't think. It seems to go against the purpose of his generally very humble and open-minded approach to the study. Anyway, we can forgive and cope with those kind of discrepancies, but they are there. There are some gaps there. Overall, though, I think if you are someone who is in his main audience, let's call them mainstream Christians, in other words, people who abide by and take Scripture as their main reference for the way they live and for their beliefs, and you're trying to understand the experience of different trans people, and he makes the point very clearly that there is no one size fits all, and that every trans person's experience is unique, or is special to them at least, then this book will take you a very long way in that exploration, and I think it will be very helpful in prompting a debate that you might want to have, questions you might want to hold open around the theology or a Christian response to the trans debate and issues arising from that. So a very important book, a helpful one, well studied, and covers a lot of ground. I would recommend it. As I say, I have some caveats, but overall, I think this is a very good primer, if we can call it that. The notes are very extensive, and certainly on topics like autogynephilia, you will have to follow through on the references in order to get to the root of the arguments. There's quite a lot buried in the notes that perhaps is skipped in the text. So I would recommend skimming through those as well. Very useful appendix also on suicide and mental health problems, and help available for trans people who are very high in terms of the percentage relative to the normal population in having mental health problems and suicidal tendencies. He covers topics like late onset dysphoria, the question of those who are committed to transitioning in their Christian discipleship path. As I say, intersex is covered very well. And also he gives a lot of attention to trans women as well as trans men's experiences based on a lot of interviews and clear pastoral ministry that he has offered himself to trans people over a number of years. So a lot here is based on listening to the experiences of trans people, doing homework around what scientists and theologians have to say, and coming to his own conclusions. Ultimately, as with any book like this, we have to come to our own.